I'm excited to welcome you to the first day of ANHD's 11th Annual Community Development Conference, Fight Forward. And for those who don't know, I am Barika Williams. I am the Executive Director of ANHD. Thank you, Antonio. For some of you, actually more than a few of you, this is probably the first time I've gotten to see you, especially in person, which feels crazy. But I took over as Executive Director at ANHD back in January 2020. So I have seen many of you on Zoom, but only Zoom. So it is amazing, and I'm thrilled to finally be in person with so many of you because it has been a long time coming. This year for ANHD's conference, I'm really excited that we've reformatted and reimagined our conference. And moving from the traditional corporate banquet halls and ballrooms centered in Times Square to really recentering our capital and our investments and our conversations in the communities that ANHD works with day in and day out. So we're working to bring in vitality and the potential and the discussions and the energy that our neighborhoods so often give to us as ANHD staff to our broader groups and conversation. We really took some time in COVID to ask ourselves as a staff, like, how can we do this differently? How can we think about our conference and our membership and supporting our communities differently? And this is what that looks like. So this is our first of our reimagined 4-borough conference event series. So our conference events are being hosted here in Astoria, Queens, in Cypress Hills, in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and in Morningside Heights / Mott Haven. So we'll have one we're in Queens, Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the Bronx. And one of the things we are working to do in this conference event that you may not see up front, but is important for us to say, is that we're also prioritizing using local vendors and MWBE vendors throughout this, because we really want to think about how we use our ANHD dollars and the sponsorship dollars that make this all possible to really support a broader community investment and network. So we hope that you all will join us for some of the next 3 events that include September 29th, October 6th, and October 20th. It'll be a fun couple of months. I want to also start off by thanking all of the folks who make this possible. So huge thank you to the ANHD staff. We are one of those folks where the staff put in a lot of effort to make each one of these events, and I know some of them are outside and some of them are in here. I see a couple over there. There we go. One's back there. So a huge kudos to all the ANHD staff. To our ANHD board, I know we've got Aaron Kurlander in here from Greater Jamaica. I think Leah Archibald from Evergreen. Our board will be in attendance throughout the various different events, so I want to thank them. And thank you especially to our sponsors who have made this possible. A special thank you to our movement leader sponsor, Citi, who's here with us today, to our community convener sponsor, Goldman Sachs. Where are you guys? There we go. To our neighborhood defender sponsor, Wells Fargo, and to our lead law partner, Goldstein Hall, who works with many of our ANHD members. I also want to again thank CAV for their amazing work earlier today. And many of them had to head out because they have to get their leaders back to their jobs and their work and their various different pieces. So I think some of them are going to try to rejoin us a little bit later. But it is no easy feat to do the work of community organizing and community building with your local neighborhood leaders. So huge thank you to CAV for setting this up and sharing their stories with us. All right. First, I want to extend some huge gratitude to the Museum of the Moving Image for hosting us here today. And I want to invite Carl Goodman, the Executive Director from the Museum of Moving Image, up to say a couple of words, and then I'll be right back.
Thanks, Barika. As she said, I'm the Executive Director of the Museum of the Moving Image, Carl Goodman. It is such a pleasure to have you here. We have been with the community and for the community, not just now, but for 34 years. Quick bit of information that a lot of people don't know, but I think could be relevant to this event. We were born out of an economic development project to save a crumbling movie studio, formerly the headquarters of Paramount Pictures in 1920, from oblivion. The result, with community leaders, people in the industries, and also in government, was the Astoria Motion Picture and Television Foundation, which bought the land from the federal government for $1 and split off, leased the main studio building to George Kaufman for his work in creating dreams in the movie industry, and our work as a nonprofit serving the community to fulfill those dreams. And here we are today. You can visit our, with the family, I hope, the Jim Henson exhibition, which really is about unity and civility in many, many ways. Come back also Saturday for a celebration of Mexican Independence Day with a full roster of programs involving music and film and food, all drawn from the local community, and both hyper-local in this neighborhood and in Queens in general. So I told you why we're here. I know why you're here. So I'm going to quickly get you back to Barika, who I thank again tremendously for their investment in being able to essentially allow us to pay the 7 hourly employees working on this event, and plus many, many others who make these events possible behind the scenes, including Carolyn in the booth. Hello. Without her, there'll be nothing on the screen. Thank you very much, and have a great day.
Thank you, Carl. Okay, so over the 4 days of the conference, we're going to delve into a variety of topics, talking about home ownership, issues around homeowners and tenants, challenges and how we confront modern day redlining, how we build merchant power and think about our small businesses. And throughout all of these conversations, you're going to hear a common theme, common issue that comes up, which is around racial equity and racial justice, right? And how we understand, how we, ANHD, our members, some of our allies, some of the stakeholders, everybody is really trying to think about this and push further and think and work differently. Today's conversation is about land use justice, in case you didn't know, and it's an incredibly timely topic, which has been in the local news and in the local press any variety of times. You can pretty much turn to any neighborhood and any borough in New York City, and there is some sort of land use action and some sort of big land use conversation happening. What we at ANHD really think about is how we try to bring a more equitable approach to planning in New York City. How can we think about creating a planning process and land use processes that lift up and create land use equity, that give rise to the needs and the voices of our most marginalized communities and populations? And that ranges from everything from affordable housing to open space, to, as Carl was just talking about, good paying jobs, right? Our land use conversations really intersect with a lot of different things. We'll be hearing a lot more about this today and how this looks citywide, right? Not just here in Astoria from our amazing panel, and how we can build power for marginalized communities to create a more equitable land use and planning process. I want to thank a variety of elected officials and staff who are in the office. We have Department of City Planning who is here. Obviously, the Brooklyn BP, Antonio Reynoso, is here. There's also representatives from the Queens Borough President's office as well, the Public Advocate's office, City Council Member Julie Wan, and I believe there's 1 or 2 other City Council members' offices as well. So if I missed you, I'm sorry. I want to invite Barlow Flores, Senior Vice President for Community Relations and Northeast Leader at City, up to speak and give some introductory remarks for us as we kick off. And again, I want to thank City for making this possible. City has continually invested in ANHD, really holding and hosting critical conversations and dialogue, and really invested a lot of trust and confidence in us to be able to push forward conversations that we need to be having as New Yorkers to move our city forward. So.
All right, good morning, everyone. Oh, I should raise this up. A little taller than Barika. Can everyone hear me now? All right, good morning. As Barika mentioned, my name is Barlow Flores, and I'm Senior Vice President, lead the Northeast region for Community Relations at Citi. Really thrilled to be here with ANHD, which has been a longtime partner for Citi. And with so many other community organizations and community partners and member organizations that are advancing equity not only here in New York City, but across the country. And the last 2 years have really shined a light on the urgent need to tackle issues of equity in the U.S., as Barika talked about. And at Citi and the Citi Foundation, we have committed to help close those racial wealth gap in the U.S. Our Action for Racial Equity commitments look at ways to center racial equity in our company in a holistic way, identifying how we transform from a company that stands against racism into a company working towards becoming an anti-racist institution. We've supported community leaders like ANHD for well over a decade with flexible funding and support that is helping to create innovative solutions like this one and collaborate with so many member organizations to support those most impacted across our communities. We've invested equity in minority deposit institutions. We've also increased our spend with diverse suppliers. And I'm also very proud of the work that we've done internally to diversify our teams, embed racial equity into our business practices and policies so it becomes institutionalized across our firm. This is one of our key measures of success and critical to the longevity of these efforts. We're proud of these efforts, but we know that there's so much more that we can do, so much more that we can learn, especially from all of us here. And quality data has a critical role to play, which I know will be an important part of this conversation. Data that helps us understand how inequity impacts specific communities can drive specific and targeted solutions. That's why I'm so excited about this conversation and this panel here today, because I know that the work that these panelists have done can inform all of our efforts and help ensure that the solutions we champion truly drive an equitable society that we aim to create. So thank you again to Barika and the entire ANHD team, the board, and we're so excited to be a part of this innovative conference series. Thank you.
Thank you again, Barlow. Oh, yes, he's much taller than me. Even in the heels, he's taller than me. Thank you again, Barlow, and thanks again to all the sponsors who are supporting this conference series. So I want to make a couple of logistical notes for folks. Note that the panel will be recorded and will be made available on ANHD's YouTube page early about next week. So feel free to rewatch and circulate. A note about audience Q&A after the panel, which is that we have a lot of different folks and a lot of different types of voices in this space. We will not have time to get to everybody's questions because I know some of you guys' faces, and so I know people are going to want to engage in a good conversation. So just be mindful of timing when you're asking your question. Please try to keep it brief. Let's give the panelists time to get back and really answer and respond, and we'll do our best to try to accommodate all the questions, but we likely will not be able to address them all. And then before I turn it over to the panel, I do want to begin the conversation with really an acknowledgement that we are having a land use conversation that connects to a longer and broader set of fights and battles around land use, and that we cannot sort of think of the conversations that we're having today and the issues that are coming up today devoid of all the work that has connected across issues of land, of property, and of home here in Queens, here in Astoria, and in a variety of different places. So as we think about and as we get into this conversation, it's good to remind ourselves and ground ourselves in the connections between the work of the Lenape to fight for their homes and the stolen land, and how that connects to things like Seneca Village, and how that connects to urban renewal, and how that connects to deed theft, and how that connects to the things that we're talking about today. And that all of us stand on and build from the work that has happened before us. And so it's always important to ground the conversations that we're having in all those who have fought similar fights in order for us to even be here and be present having these conversations. So now I want to bring up our panel. I'm incredibly excited for this group of folks. So I want to, did I do that? No? I was like, whoops. So I want to bring up and introduce our panelists. Brooklyn Borough President Antonio Reynoso, who will be moderating. Come on up. New York City Council Member Julie Wan of District 26 in Queens. Executive Director of Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition, Sandra Lobo. And Executive Director of Southwest Brooklyn Industrial Development Corporation, Jesse Solomon. Let's give them all a round of applause and a welcome. And Antonio, I will turn it over to you. You want to come up here? All right, let's go.
Good morning. Oh man, that lunch was lightweight, I guess. Not enough people ate it. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, this is going to be a lot of fun. I'm very excited to be here. As you all know, I am Antonio Reynoso, and I am the president of the greatest borough in the city of New York, which is Brooklyn. All right.
We're in Queens.
Oh, there you go. So I do want to start off by saying that I've gotten my passport from Donovan Richards, who said I was allowed to be here today. So I'm extremely grateful to him and to you all. And this is one of my favorite topics to talk about, which is land use justice. And before I start, I just want to acknowledge Erin and Lacey, who helped write what I'm about to say right now and pretty much run my land use department locally. So I'm really grateful to them and the work that they do to help me make sure I can communicate this in a meaningful way. We're now 9 months into the new administration. And while the mayor has promised a more specific vision for land use in time, what we know now is that he wants New York City to be a city of yes. And I think that we've all interpreted this to mean that he supports more development. I agree with him that more development is necessary to address our current housing crisis, but I think how and where that development happens needs to change in a way that centers around justice. In New York City, we often struggle to see the big picture. Planning issues do not occur in isolation. They are cyclical, deeply intertwined, and do not recognize geographic boundaries. Yet our planning efforts are often myopic, developer-driven, and disjointed. As ANHD so perfectly described it, our current planning paradigm continually puts community in a reactive position, forced to push back with limited time and resources on inequitable proposals that do not meet community need. And as I learned leading a planning process in Bushwick that lasted for over 6 years, even when communities do put forth their own visions, the city doesn't always work with them in good faith. So now we have the opportunity to use this time to create a new model. That's why I think ANHD's proposal for development of community principles is so exciting. And most important piece, in my opinion, is arming stakeholders with data and using that data to create local visions that balance community priorities with citywide need. It is also critical for us to understand that the intent of creating community principles is not to have a reason to say no to all new development. Instead, it's giving us the framework and creating a pathway for us to say yes to projects that meet the community's criteria for development that centers justice. And the development of these statements as a whole can push us forward or further toward a comprehensive vision for the city's future. Of course, I've been beating the drum on citywide comprehensive planning for many years, and I haven't given up on that. I believe that comprehensive planning allows us to uncover the true nature of urban problems, understand the scope of their impact, and develop holistic and responsive approaches. As borough president, I have a formal role in the land use process, and so I'm putting my money where my mouth is, so to speak. My land use team is working with the Regional Planning Association and the New York Academy of Medicine to create a comprehensive plan for Brooklyn. It is a heavily data-driven process aimed at addressing public health disparities in our borough through land use. My goal is to use data and big picture thinking to end what I call the YIMBY, NIMBY doom loop, where every project is considered without much, if any, broader context. And while we need to ensure that data is guiding our process, it does not mean that community engagement is no longer important. Any planning process worth undertaking should still be and have a robust community engagement strategy to not only inform but also get feedback from communities who are traditionally left out of the decision-making process. We will look to their lived experiences to help us interpret the data for their own neighborhoods. We aim to produce a framework that not only guides our ULURP responses, but that other stakeholders, community boards, city council members, and developers can use to help streamline their decision-making as well. And now, I'm really excited to have a broader discussion on the community principles and land use justice with this excellent panel that I would like to introduce now. Sandra Lobo, the Executive Director of Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Council, a grassroots member-led organization that has organized in the Northwest Bronx since 1974. A round of applause for these folks, please. Julie Wan, City Council Member, District 26 in Queens. And I'm gonna help you out here. Western Queens, including Long Island City, Sunnyside, Astoria, Woodside, is the first woman and immigrant to represent this district in the city's history. There you go. Jesse Solomon, the Executive Director of Southwest Brooklyn Industrial Development Corporation, which serves the working waterfront neighborhoods of Sunset Park, Red Hook, and Gowanus with businesses and workforce services, as well as equitable development and planning. Thank you. Now I'm gonna go sit with them, but thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to say a few words. So I'm gonna sit now. So good morning to you all. This is gonna be a lot of fun because it's gonna be a discussion. And I think a lot of folks are over lectures and just continuously hearing from a few people. And part of the work that we wanna do is allow for other voices to be heard, non-traditional voices to be heard. So we're gonna do the best we can here to get through this panel in a concise way, in a fun way, and just a living room setting. So I'm gonna ask questions and then kind of try to lead from the heart. So I'm going to start for Sandra. What has been your experience from the perspective of grassroots organizing group with trying to ensure that community priorities in your neighborhood were centered in local planning or rezoning process? That's it. Yeah, that's it. That's it. That's the question.
So thank you
Yes,
for
thank you.
that question, and thank you to ANHD for the invitation. So again, Sandra Lobo, Executive Director at Northwest Bronx. I've been in this role for 7 years, though I have been a board member and a leader in the organization for almost 30 years. I live and raise my 2 children in the Bronx. It's a community that's very important to me. The Northwest Bronx, as we've already heard, is 48 years old. Organization. It's a grassroots member-led organization. Our mission is focused on racial justice and economic democracy. And we organize around housing, education, community and health, community development, and equitable economic development. And our inception started in 1974. Our inception was in response to planning where we were not included, right? We were really responding at the time in response to redlining and disinvestment by public and private institutions, and a good sense of what was happening at the time. New York City official planner Roger Starr, 1976, proposed planned shrinkage, which was to cut essential services to communities that were considered, lost or not interested in investing in them. And the Bronx and parts of Brooklyn were included in that plan, and that was cutting things like transportation, sanitation, and firehouses. And in fact, the reason why many of us know the term the Bronx is burning is not only because redlining encouraged landlords or incentivized landlords to burn their own buildings to get a return on their investment, but also there were no firehouses to actually respond to the burning that was happening. And so Northwest Bronx was born out of that planning that excluded us, that did not have our futures in mind. And many organizations in the Bronx and across New York City were born in response to planning that excluded our voices. We can look at projects, I'm just going to speak about the Bronx, like the Kingsbridge Armory, the Croton Water Filtration Plant, Yankee Stadium, the Gateway Mall, the Jerome Avenue rezoning, et cetera. I could be here all day talking to you about projects where the community was marginalized and the process was not included, and at best was tokenized in a process. My heart was really hurting earlier when I heard members of this community here in Queens talk about how they were not engaged, how they were not invited to be a part of that process. The experience of Black and brown folks in New York City is universal in these processes. And so hearing the speakers share their experience and share their heartbreak of the potential of losing their communities is very much the story of Bronx folks organizing for self-determination and for their futures. Our experience has mainly been about where we learn about these plans through studies about our communities. These studies often talk to us about or share what is wrong with our community, what the challenges and needs are through a very narrow lens. And these studies often share recommendations and solutions that we weren't a part of designing, nor we feel like reflect our priorities. So to sum up, our experience generally has been that we are creating simultaneous planning processes, right? So while a formal process is happening that is led by the city, community organizations are organizing community members a number to address a couple of things, 4 main things that I'd like to lift up that don't often happen in processes, planning processes. One is to help the community understand what's going on. And that is everything from what's the goal of this process, what is the timeline, is the language inclusive, is the language shared, or is the information shared in a language that everyone can understand? The second is to identify authentic community priorities, right? So often these studies or plans have a goal, and that goal does not necessarily align with the priorities of the local community. Third is to share values or principles that can help guide a process and decision making. And so community organizations often take on this role to help the community kind of align and build power that can ensure that their vision and goals are included. And finally, to organize community stakeholders to ensure that their voices are included. So this can be helping people prepare for testimonies, written and oral, to ensure that they have a seat at the table.
Thank you for that, Sandra. And I guess it speaks to the ULURP process more than anything else, and that the ULURP process has a charter mandated timeline that these developers in the city has to move through that make it very difficult for us to set rules as to how a community should and can engage for it to be meaningful. But then we have Councilmember Julie Wan that says, hey, I think I can do something a little different by setting principles ahead of time so that a developer knows the bare minimum of how an engagement is going to happen in our community. If you can't meet these, then we don't even need to start. And it kind of gives us an extended clock or a pre-clock to ULURP, which I think is very interesting. Can you speak to the principles and the approach that you're taking to land use projects in your district?
Thank you so much, Borough President Reynosa. But before I start, good morning. I need you to kind of shake your shoulders left and right, get a little wiggly. I need to make sure that you're awake, making eye contact with every single one of you. And I got to neutralize this energy. Queens, get the money. We're in Queens. All right?
Congratulations, Queens.
Thank you. So it's so good to be here with you. First and foremost, I think it's really important that we continue to look at the intersectionality of it all. As the executive director has said, we are standing on Lenape land, or we're sitting in it. For me, when I started my journey into politics as someone who is from the outside, as a woman in tech, it was because of my own personal experience in displacement. During the thick of COVID, I had gotten a call from my workplace saying, okay, we're no longer traveling because I was a consultant. Everyone is grounded. And we're going to take a look at who will be here and who is disposable, who is going to be furloughed, and you'll be working part-time. And at that time, simultaneously, my parents, as an immigrant, they were working odd jobs at small businesses as employees. My mom, as a nail salon worker, she was let go because people did not want to be in contact businesses where you are being physically contacted or touched by another person. That meant that my dad, who was elderly at retirement age and 40 years of smoking, cannot be outside during that time. So that meant as a child of immigrants, I know that many of us are the safety net for our families. I had to forego my apartment so that I could pay for their living expenses, because it's much easier for someone in their 30s to be displaced than two people in their 60s to be displaced. And because I was foregoing my rent, guess what? There was a loophole where even if the eviction moratorium had ended, if your lease was up, there was nothing legally protecting you from having your lease renewed. That meant I had to go scrambling and find someone where they would let me sleep on their couch. So with that experience, everything is interconnected. Not only were people being displaced, but people were also going hungry. And with that experience, we also saw the impact on it that it had on schools. And that's what we continue to see today. We have an increase on folks being evicted. The right to counsel is pretty much eliminated. And children from my shelters, which I have more than 20 homeless shelters within a 1 mile radius from this museum, are currently going into my school system, which has lost funding, especially in my Black and brown schools. Everything is an interconnected web within our community. And that is why it is only the bare minimum that I, as a council member who gets a final say with my colleagues in the land use process, to say, I need to make sure that my pillars, my values, that nobody can take away from me because I've lived it, is community engagement, especially with language access. Do you know how many immigrants have no idea what is happening in their neighborhood simply because they don't have the time to go to their town hall meetings? And even if they did, it's all in English. Do you know how many people have no idea what is happening within 2 miles from their house, 1 mile from their house, especially if they live in a NYCHA? Because the only time that someone contacts them is because they want you to come and be a tokenized person of color to say, I support this project because I'm going to promise you a job. And that promise is rarely ever kept. So we wanted to make sure that community engagement is our top pillar, our top priority, as well as affordability. My district has been the second most developed in the entire city, a 90% market rate. You just heard the executive director of this organization say that this building was bought at $1. Within the last 20 years, we have allowed this district to be completely renewed and redeveloped, for better or for worse. And immigrants like my families, this Sunnyside, New York, within my district, had the highest concentration of Korean immigrants in the 80s. After the migration, after the Korean War. Yet, how many of us are left here? We joke around that at this point, we're going to end up in Montauk because we're being pushed out eastward, and eastward, further into Queens, where we find affordable places to live and do business. And yet, the places that we once called home have apartment rents for a 1-bedroom over $3,500. The second thing because of that, we wanted to make sure that affordability is a top priority for our land use principles. And then thirdly, we wanted to make sure that it was community investment. My district has seen an immense amount of flooding. This is hurricane season. Last year at this time, we lost a family to flooding. A 2-year-old drowned and died with their parents because they were living in basement apartments. And when you come to me and you say, well, it's illegal, they shouldn't have been living there in the first place. People don't choose to live somewhere that is undignified because they want to. They do it because it's all they can afford. They have the right to deserve dignified housing, yet our city has failed them, and they have no choice but to risk their lives to have a roof over their head. You cannot make people choose between their livelihood and safety and a roof over their head. Lastly, we wanted to make sure, especially because my district is 60% rent burdened or highly rent burdened in total, that means that we are also at a high risk, not only for displacement, but for unemployment. And with the largest NYCHA in my district, Queensbridge houses, as well as Ravenswood houses, as well as Woodside houses, and Astoria houses not too far from here, Jobs are essential to our quality of life. And we have seen over and over and over again where labor is used against people of color, working class families, and we cannot allow people to weaponize us against each other. And we have to be united, which is why, as an underlying pillar for all of the three top priorities for us, and community engagement, community investment, as well as affordability, is using union labor. So we are going to continue to build relationships with our union labor folks, and we are seeing it right now as we're standing on the very site of Innovation Queens, which is a $2 billion redevelopment plan for a 5-block special rezoning, where we have seen almost violent, physically and verbally, attacks on community organizers from the labor unions. And we have said to them, this is unacceptable. You can never do this again. If you want to have a conversation, we will have a sit down, but you will not use violence. You will not threaten people of color with your size or your physical abilities, but you will have a sit down conversation so that we can all get aligned. Because as the borough president said, right, a city of yes, of course we all want to say yes. We need more housing, but it's what kind of housing? How affordable is this housing? Who is the community-based agreement for? How many signatories are there? Who is actually benefiting? And we are incredibly thankful to the ANHD staff, Alex Fennell and Chris Walters. They pretty much handheld us every single sentence along the way, as well as our community organizers like CAV, Woodside on the Move, Astoria Tenants Union, Western Queens Land Trust, and so much more. Thank you so much.
So, Councilmember, I wanted to follow up on that before we get to the next question. The right to self-determination is kind of like the crux and the foundation of the work that you're doing with your principals. What happens in a neighborhood like Middle Village, Mass Beth, Glendale, where their right to self-determination speaks about no shelters in their district, no affordable housing, no development whatsoever? And what ends up happening is that we're allowing for principles set forth for neighborhoods that have been taken advantage of to be mirrored in neighborhoods that have never seen any, have not contributed to the greater good when it comes to getting us out of the hole of affordable housing or housing in general, of homeless shelters and other needs and uses. How do we, I guess, find common ground here or push back against people that have their own self-determination and their own principles that might not align with ours?
Yes. I mean, it's like anything in organizing, right? As especially all of us in this room that consider ourselves as housing organizers in one form or another, one of the most important things is that we're communicating, because all of this is a dialogue between us and whoever else is sitting across from us in this neighborhood. And that's why having land use principles that are written and public that can be discussed is so important. And that's why my office, as well as ANHD, is reaching out to other council members saying, hey, could you start to pen your own? And when I could see it in writing with another council member, that's when I could say, hello, council member, I saw your land use principles. What an interesting principle you have of no homeless people. Yes, exactly. So we always want to keep people accountable, but it's harder for us to keep people accountable if we don't have documentation or evidence for their justifications for their land use decisions. And if we can normalize or standardize having written documentation of how each community is going to say yes or no to a land use to a land use proposal, then we can continue to push, whether it be media, whether it be organizing our colleagues in City Hall, or leveraging our borough president to say, hey, you used to represent Queens also, to have these conversations of overlapping elected officials as well as our public. I think that those are some of the evening out the power that we're talking about of the different power dynamics, because there are community members who may not align with our values, which is why this is really a conversation about values as well as a city.
Yes, yeah. So and we're going to get into that, because I do want to talk about member deference, which is going to be a fun conversation when we're talking about other spaces. But Jesse, a lot of these conversations almost exclusively center around affordable housing. You just heard Councilmember Juan speak about the jobs and making sure that, look, that's a principle that we're going to talk about from the beginning, from the get-go, that is absolutely necessary. So we don't need to be used against each other to build in land use conversations. But I want to be honest, that's a new idea or something that we haven't seen in the past in our land use processes in the city council. So do you ever feel left out? Do you feel like these conversations are not centered around jobs or around manufacturing and other non-housing type land use or planning processes?
Sure. Thanks so much for the question. And thank you, ANHD, for inviting me to be on this really exciting panel. I'm so passionate about housing issues, but my organization, Southwest Brooklyn Industrial Development Corporation, or SBIDC, we've been around for 45 years, serving Sunset Park, Gowanus, and Red Hook over in Brooklyn. And our mission is to help preserve and grow the industrial and manufacturing sector. And the reason we do that is because, you know, in any land use, major land use conversation, jobs, of course, do come up. And then the next question is, well, what kind of jobs, as you both alluded to, right? The reason why we believe that industrial and manufacturing jobs are so critical to New York City's economy is because if we're going to approach policy decisions through a lens of equity and racial justice, we need to think about economic development strategies that are inclusive of folks who have different barriers to entering the job market, right? If English isn't your first language, or if you don't have, access to higher education or advanced degrees, what are the jobs that are available to you that will still give you beyond just minimum wage, right? And we look at industrial and manufacturing jobs, especially as they're concentrated in the industrial business zones in New York City. And we see that new manufacturing and industrial jobs pay 29% more than new retail jobs. And then they pay 50% more than new accommodation and hospitality jobs. So even though they make up a small percentage of New York City's economy, they're really vital to a particular group of people in New York City. 80% of people in this sector are people of color, right? So we need to think about there's many tools, but today we're speaking about land use. So how do we think about using land use to help make sure that the industrial sector in New York City thrives? And it's not just about the jobs too, right? It's about the functionality of our city. It's about a just transition in our city. It's about thinking about ushering, offshore wind and solar panel manufacturing to New York City. And we won't be able to do that if we keep eroding away at the industrial zones, right? Since 2005, we've seen a 25% decrease in industrial or M zone land in New York. Sometimes there's good reason for that, right? Like we've also seen in environmental justice communities where, certain waste transfer stations or whatever it is create an undue burden on particular marginalized communities. So we need to address this holistically. So I'm excited to get into some of the conversation about, citywide policy versus local concerns that you were just kind of teasing out. Yeah,
and that's good, great to know, because we want to do the transitional work towards like a greener, more sustainable society, and just especially when it comes to the jobs we want to find. But if we don't have 1 million square feet to hold that ridiculous sized windmill wing, I guess is what I'll call it, then they won't be here, physically won't be here. So the manufacturing, the preservation of that has really allowed us to start having a conversation about how we build for our future here in the city of New York. But without manufacturing, we would never be able to do that. And those are great jobs that can go to our local community. So love to hear that. I'm a crazy manufacturing guy. I love manufacturing.
I know. Thank you so much for your support.
No, thank you. I've been fighting for it, and it's a tough fight. It's a lonely fight in the city council, because not everyone has a industrial business district. So it's part of this conversation that I really want to have, where individual council members are doing what's in the best interest of their local communities, almost outside of the guise and perspective of the entire city. Like, what does someone that has no manufacturing district, or a council member that has no manufacturing district in their neighborhood, care about what's happening in Red Hook or in Sunset Park? And figuring out a way to bring all that together so we could have a better conversation about how we all contribute to the greater good of this city. And I do want to, the next part is have a conversation about, has there ever been a process in this city that has made us feel that the community is involved, that they did have a say, that we got to a good process? Has it ever existed? And I want to kind of start in the Bronx a bit and just have a conversation, because then what I think we're doing, and what ends up happening, is allowing for the system, ULURP, right? ULURP, to dictate that we'll never get to a yes, or until we don't change ULURP, It's always going to be a no. And that's okay if that's what the realization we've come to. But then let's say that out loud and say the ULURP process in itself makes it so that there's no way that we can ever get to a place where community feels they had input and that the outcomes are going to be centered around land use justice. Or is there a way under the current system to get to an end goal that a community would like? And I just wanted to get your perspective on that.
That's a tough question.
Uh-oh.
Here we go. That's a tough question. Have we ever felt included? No. At least in my own memory of our organization, again, I mentioned earlier, the community, and this is not unique to the Bronx, I've seen it in all kinds of, all of the boroughs, community organizations often, organize a concurrent process with what's happening that the city is leading. And there's often a fight of what that will look like, how will community voices be included. And I just want to lift up and affirm Councilmember Juan's principles. If we had those decades ago in the Bronx by our council members, I think things would have looked very, very different. So instead, because we're not included, we create our own processes and we create our own broad coalitions. And so I want to lift up Kingsbridge Armory. How many of y'all know about the Kingsbridge Armory? Great. So it's the world's largest armory, and it's the community, the Northwest Bronx, has been organizing for almost 30 years to redevelop this incredible asset that's been laid empty for decades. And it started, young people kind of looking around and realizing that their schools were overcrowded and saying, like, this is an empty castle literally right next to us. Why can't schools be in there? And then realizing because of landmark status, you can't make housing and schools in there, but you can do other things. And so it was the community organizing that started to demand investment in this place. Instead of thinking about what would be good for our community, the Bloomberg administration wanted to put a big box mall in this armory right next to a burgeoning commercial district and a few blocks away from the third largest commercial district, because that's what our community needed, was a retail mall. And so we gathered with labor and faith institutions and other community organizations, and it was the only project that Bloomberg that proposed that was defeated, and it was actually in spite of our local council member who wanted that, who was in support of that. So that's kind of historic in and of itself. It was the rest of the city council that stood with us, given the values and principles that we had created for the vision of our community, and it was because of our partnership with labor. I want to lift that up because I think, especially as we're talking about land use, my experience in decades of doing this work, we have community here and we have labor over there. Can I see some nods? Yes, no, that's not your experience. Always, we're pitted against each other, right? We can either have good jobs or we can have affordability. It's one or the other. And our experience is that's a false dichotomy. In fact, the way in which we are going to have real transformation in our communities is by standing together. Instead of fighting for a piece of the pie, we can actually have the whole pie, right? We just have different parts of the pie when we're working together. So we're really proud of the work that we've done in the Bronx with Local 79, that have been incredible partners, trusted partners that have stood with community around affordability, and we've stood with them around thinking about good jobs and how do we ensure union labor. And so I want to lift that up as probably one of the prime things that I think are necessary for our communities is to have these broad coalitions that identify shared principles and values, and that are building these broad coalitions to win our vision for our community and have equitable economic development.
Right. So that's a no. What you're saying is no, there hasn't been a process that you've seen that has made you feel that the community was involved in a meaningful way and that outcomes ended up being a level of self-determination from a local community. You haven't seen that in the Bronx. Not
being facilitated by a government entity, no. I would say the community has played that role as mediator, role as negotiator, right? So we won a historic CBA in 2013, and that is because our council members didn't have a set of principles, right? We had to negotiate principles for our community because it wasn't a given that there was benefits for our community. We wanted economic development, but we were not thinking about how could this economic development actually displace or gentrify our community or actually benefit our community. So no.
Okay. So then it gets back to this comprehensive planning. So we're doing comprehensive planning in Brooklyn. Hopefully in March, you guys will see something really cool. ANHD is a part of the conversation we're having alongside RPA and New York Medicine Academy. I'm going to try my best there. I apologize to them. I appreciate everything you're doing with our office. So we're trying to do a comprehensive plan because what we're trying to say in Brooklyn is that we're no longer going to allow for individual neighborhoods to live in like a microcosm. We want everybody to contribute to the greater good. And we actually feel, let's give an example, Bushwick, or better, East New York. East New York has built like 20,000 units of affordable housing. They've probably done more than anyone in Brooklyn in contributing to the greater good of housing development. There are other neighborhoods that haven't seen a rezoning since like 1964, right? And they've done nothing when it comes to increasing housing supply, whether it's market rate or affordable housing. What we're tasking all of them is East New York would feel better if they knew that they were a part of a larger conversation. It's like, oh, we have 20,000, but there's 200,000 that's going to be built in Brooklyn. And we're all a part of it. And we're all going to do this together. But that doesn't happen. It's like black and brown communities that are poor, you do all the work while we're all protected. So we're trying to do comprehensive planning. The biggest challenge we have is that I have the authority to make a recommendation to the local council member. My comprehensive plan is going to be put forth for this accountability that the council member was talking about. Being able to tell somebody is like, you are doing nothing to contribute to the greater good. We're not going to let you do that. You have 0 homeless shelters in your district. Why do we need to go to Charles Barron's district and build another one? Why does he need a 17th one when you don't even have one? And we can do that, but we can't do that. I can do that and shame them as much as I can, but we can't do that if member deference is alive and well and used to protect those communities. And I want to be clear. I think member deference has value in the cases where these communities have been abused and taken advantage of for a long time. But in the flip side, it's used as a weapon to keep people out, to historical preservation versus development. In some cases where there's no historical value to their neighborhood, but it's just keep people out. So I just want to kind of have that conversation, council member, about how do we square that and are allowed to fight in a citywide or borough-wide model instead of just a council by council model. And we might not have the answer, but I just want to ask it because it's a challenge.
I think first and foremost, as a former community board member, we were always very creative. I gotta give props to my neighborhoods in this district because we are nimble, we are agile, we are all for the coup d'etats. Like, we are ready to burn it all down. On February 14th, when I think now it's like almost 5-6 years ago, when Amazon HQ2 was announced, that deal was done in a back room. Jimmy Van Bramer had signed on, Senator Gianaris had signed on initially, and then it all went to shit because the community said no. So yeah, it's difficult when you have a member, whether it's city council or any elected official, who does not reflect the community's desires or needs. And that could be arguable, especially in a district like mine where I have very wealthy residents in Hunters Point and homeowners within the landmark in Sunnyside Gardens. Yet I also have all the NYCHAs, and then I have affordable housing units like the Phipps housing, etc. And all of this, at the end of the day, what we are hearing from our nonprofit partners as well as our borough president is that because we have a broken ULURP process, even if I went outside right now and I stopped someone random and I'm like, what do you think about the ULURP? They'd be like, you what? What language is that? And I'm like, exactly. No one even knows what this is unless you're in this room and you're all nerds. So I think first and foremost, we have to address that the ULURP process is broken. We cannot have comprehensive planning as long as we continue to have a structure that puts the power within the individual council member per district, and there's no standardization of what that means, of how they vote and how they act, because their values are not aligned as a city. And when it comes to member deference, for right now, for me personally, exactly like you said, as someone who is facing a $2 billion development that is contentious, it is in my favor to continue to wield in that power to say, listen, colleagues, this is why my community is against it. My community board has voted against it. My borough president has voted against it. Like, you gotta stick by me. But it's used and weaponized against certain communities who want to preserve some things that may not align to our values. So I think at the end of the day, until we see the mayor put out something that is substantial, where we have something in writing, I always say, if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. And we gotta have something documented so that we can give feedback and keep them accountable. But until we have that, it's all within us to make that change. Because for us, we have to make sure that what's within my power, I'm going to create land use principles with my community, and then I'm going to keep on socializing it. Like, my land use director is going to the community board to socialize our current draft as our iteration, and we'll continue to evolve it because nothing is static in this world. And we want to continue to evolve. But when it comes to member deference, we can't just silo it and cherry pick and be like, member deference is an issue, because it's a part of a whole process that is an issue. Member deference would not exist if we didn't have such a broken process. So I think first and foremost, I think we need to have a serious conversation with City Planning Commission and say, we need to make sure that having community input should not be an afterthought. It has to be mandatory before certification. It should, like, for an example, Innovation Queens, we had community input after the community vote. Stop putting lipstick on a pig. We have to change the traditional way where it's just very performative, where they say, okay, we're gonna do this like dog and pony show, where the developer and the lobbyists come and they do the same old thing that they've done for years, for like decades, with the same community partners, like get the same community-based agreements. Like, we can't do that anymore. And I told them, like, stop saying, like, people use this terminology very frequently, like leaving fat on the bones for the council member, so that when we're negotiating, even though the community has already asked for it, let's give all the credit to the elected officials so that they get all the kudos for it, for doing such a good job negotiating. And I'm saying, no more. I don't want to do this old school dog and pony show. Like, I'm not here for a yeehaw. Like, no, I'm here for my community. These are the people who voted me in. This is the life that I represent. And I need you to take a firm look at yourself in the mirror and say, if you are going to be disingenuous and intellectually dishonest, you have no place in my community. And that's the end of the story.
Yeah, and we can clap it up to that. And I love to hear what you're saying. Like, the issue that I have with Department of City Planning is that they've been doing something for a long time, and it's what they know. And even through the times that we're on now, where we're constantly seeing council members shut down projects left and right, it's just no across the board. They don't change the way they do their business. They just continuously do the same thing again and think they're going to get a different outcome. And for me, it's just like, if you want to get to a yes, maybe you should do some level of self-reflection and say, hey, maybe we should change something in an effort to do better. And it doesn't happen. And what ends up happening is that we keep vilifying the communities, vilifying the council members and the people that are fighting back, instead of looking at the process as a whole and ULURP as a whole. And so I appreciate you saying that. It's music to my ears. I hope you get a lot more council members on board, because you're going to need it. And then I want to go back to like the jobs versus housing versus we want it all, I guess. And that's something that a lot of people think can't be achieved. And I say this to developers all the time. The developer will never give you their sheet of the bottom line, right? It costs this much for me to do this. It costs this much, but they'll always say this is financially not feasible. We can't do that. But they've never shown you any paperwork to show how much money they're going to make. We don't know if they're going to make $1 million off of this deal, or they're going to make $100 million. We don't know. But they're saying, oh, this doesn't work. The financing doesn't work. It's like, then show us the financing. Mm-hmm. And then then we could like cry with you and say, oh my God, you're so poor. there's no money in this. There's no way. Like, why did you even buy this property? And we could sit with you, and that doesn't happen. And also speculation. They buy these properties that, as a manufacturing property, for example, that can probably go for like $32 a square foot. They buy it for $250 a square foot. And then they go to DCP and cry and say, look, I need to build housing on it because it's the only thing that'll give me return on my investments. And DCP says, you're right. That is absolutely right. There's no way that you can support or sustain this as a manufacturing site because you paid so much for it. And they bail them out through a planning process, through the ULURP process. And it's just like, we got to have a different conversation, and we don't. And then now we go to manufacturing districts where, and I want to say, the audacity of people to think that they can build residential developments inside manufacturing districts that are actually working, or even build office space without having to build any manufacturing or contribute. I feel like it's DCP is promoting that almost. You should be ashamed. You should be scared to go to DCP and say, hey, I want to build office space or residential in a manufacturing district, especially in IBC and in IBZ. But that doesn't happen. People feel very comfortable going to DCP to keep encroaching on the manufacturing land. So I wanted to ask, if there was something you could change that can make your life better or can empower you in the planning process, what would it be? And this is going to be a question for all of you. I'm talking about manufacturing, but just, we got to get to solutions next, right? Another thing is that they claim us progressives, we just scream at everything and we never have solutions. Comprehensive planning, by the way, is a solution. I just want to say we're working on it. So I don't believe you. But what would you do differently?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways to address this question. I mean, first I want to uplift, this is related to your last question too, but I want to uplift the example of Gowanus, right? Gowanus neighborhood just went through a rezoning, and there was really a 12-year process. If you look back at Bridge of Gowanus, which was a community-led planning process, also led by former council member Brad Lander, that ultimately resulted then in a study from DCP on the neighborhood, and then finally the rezoning of the neighborhood started. And I'm uplifting this example because my organization was part of a really diverse coalition called the Gowanus Neighborhood Coalition for Justice that said, okay, we've been through Bridge and Gowanus. We're at a point, we know Gowanus has a large, white, wealthy population at this point. There's been tremendous gentrification in Gowanus, and that's the facts on the ground, right? So we know that this is a neighborhood. It's also a great transit hub. We know this is a neighborhood where, it can accommodate more housing. That was at least community is not a monolith. That was the perspective of our community-based coalition. There were lots of folks who were really vehemently against this rezoning, who had concerns that, some I thought were legitimate. Some I thought, they're concerned about not enough free parking on the street. Maybe when we think of broad policy goals, that might be less legitimate, right? So I bring it up though, because our organization, right, we fight for the manufacturing and industrial spaces in New York City, and Gowanus had a lot of M zoning throughout the district. And just as the borough president was mentioning, a lot of that land had been bought at astronomical prices. A lot of those properties bought at astronomical prices because of speculation and because they were hoping the city would rezone it. While that's true, and while we fight for industrial space, we knew that it was really important to join forces with a community coalition to see the larger priorities realized of the neighborhood. One of those priorities was definitely the desperate need for capital improvements in NYCHA in Gowanus. There's 2 large NYCHA facilities in the neighborhood. They needed over $200 million in capital investments, and they needed it 10 years ago. But that was one of the points of agreement that we were able to secure as part of the negotiation process with the city. To your question, one of the things that was so successful about that was that long-term community-based planning process that started pre-certification, started 10 years before certification of this neighborhood rezoning. So in some ways that was really helpful to let the community, let our coalition come to an agreement around these core points of agreements, but that we would win from the city in exchange for the rezoning, like the NYCHA funding. But I will say that in terms of the urban land use review process, it does put, that process is incredibly expensive, right? So when small property owners want to upzone to provide more housing, or when small industrial property owners want to upzone to create another floor to add additional manufacturing space, they're nowhere close to being able to starting the urban land use review process because of how long it takes, how expensive it is. And so what you see is a lot of luxury development, a lot of very powerful developers who are able to afford that process. So I think definitely see the need for that long-term community engagement and to empower both local communities, but also regionally. Let's think about what our values are as a city and base them in equity. But I also see the need to help. When we think about the need for more housing or the need for more space for industrial jobs, I do see the need to alter the process so that the small guys can go after what they need to do to build, right? Because right now we're working in this paradigm where only one type of development works in New York City, and that's really challenging.
True. It's like the big get bigger, but I can see somebody that owns a one-family home wanting to do a 3-story building, for example, and they can't go through $1 million ULURP process. It's worth more than the value of their property, unless they go through a citywide rezoning or neighborhood rezoning. They won't get the benefits that a 40-story tower can get to. So I can see. So you're saying like a mini ULURP process or a more affordable one, or some type of system for smaller homeowners or smaller property owners?
I think it's really only going to work, as you point out, if there's more holistic and comprehensive approaches to zoning actions in the city. Because ultimately, when we continue to take it project by project, it's really hard to come up with an equitable solution where, the small guys have a cheaper way to do this, and then larger developers, can't go through that process. Politically, that would be really hard to do. So it speaks to that need for a more holistic approach to zoning.
All right, thank you. And Sandra, what would you change? We want to have you go through a process in our lifetime here where we're happy from beginning to end. It all happened with community engagement, our input. It was actually paid attention to, put in a plan, and then executed. That's what we would like to see. What do you think we need to change to get there?
How much time you have?
Well, there you go. Give me one thing that you think you can change. And then,
there's a lot of things. I want to lift up the racial equity reports that passed. I think that's really, really important. When we were organizing around the Jerome Avenue rezoning with our partners at CASA and Local 79, we demanded a racial equity report as part of the environmental impact statement, and we were ignored.
Yes.
And the rezoning passed because there was no understanding of what that would mean to Black and brown folks in our community that withstood the redlining and the displacement for generations. If I had to, really request one thing, since you're only asking one thing, I would ask for the city to partner with community organizing groups in thinking about from start to finish, right? So community is never invited into an assessment process, into a visioning process. We're often invited into once plans have already been made, and then we're responding to that. Right. I think what you've mentioned in comprehensive planning is essential. In the Bronx right now, we have a coalition of organizations of labor, faith, and community organizations that have called ourselves the Bronx-wide Coalition, and we're creating a 30-year plan. Economic development plan for the Bronx. And we are hoping to use that as a map, as a guide, to help us understand land use, economic development, and other issues. And so when you partner with community organizing groups, you will get a yes, because the process is reflective of what community wants. And also, understanding that community organizing groups are very sophisticated and are able to think with the city around economic development processes and housing affordability, and how you build actual development. The one thing I want to lift up as part of that process that I think community organizations do really well is, we often look at the community's deficit, right? We're looking at what's wrong with the community, but we're often not looking at what the assets are that we can leverage, right? For the Bronx, I can speak for our borough, we're only talked about as the poorest congressional district in the country. We are the unhealthiest borough in New York State, or the unhealthiest county in the state. We have the highest unemployment rates. We have the highest graduation dropout rates. All of these negative statistics are the only way in which we're spoken about. We don't talk about how we have the world's most renowned cultural institutions, educational institutions, health institutions. Together, these institutions spend in the billions in procurement for goods and services, in the billions, right? And including the third largest commercial district in New York City. So it's not that we are not capable of creating wealth in the Bronx. It's that all of the wealth leaks out of the Bronx and is not invested in the people who are there. And so as we think about economic development and as we think about how building housing and all that stuff, the reason why I name community organizing groups is because that is the lens that we use in thinking about the assets and the strengths that our communities have that can actually build economic development for the entire city. So as we're thinking about the Kingsbridge Armory right now, right, we have tons of assets to leverage that could actually be transformative in the local economy, but that actually requires that the community is not asked, like, what do you think about this plan? The community is actually a thought partner and a real authentic partner in creating that vision.
Awesome. Thank you. And we want to get to, like, you guys. We want you to ask some questions. Just in case you thought my questions were terrible, you get to clean it up and make sure that this ends up being a good panel. But I want to just thank you all for your answers and your thoughtful answers and just a perspective to be able to get from folks that are in this every single day. So thank you so much. And we're all going to be taking questions from the general public. And I think there's some microphones going around. Oh, they're
No, not at all.
they're just gonna take from us. They always take from us. We're tired of it. So if you want to speak, please come to your right or your left. Anywhere, the fastest route. The fastest route.
While we're waiting for a question,
Yes.
can I answer the last question?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. There you go.
If I could change something, I would like to stop the rubber stamping of city planning. If I wanted a rubber stamp that's going to just certify anything and approve everything, as long as it takes off the check boxes of the legal procedures, etc., logistically, I would hire a monkey. Like, y'all were hired as City Planning Commission for a reason. I need to have better metrics on why we are approving and passing and continuing to certify certain projects, especially if you know that certain projects are doomed to fail. Like, we have to change that. And within my power, I am going to make sure that before certification, community engagement is done. Years before, especially for large scale projects, not after it's already certified, to say, we're going to give you a fake chance to give us input about what we don't care what you think about, but that's okay.
Okay, there you go. She said it. Any questions? Oh, I did a good job. Hey, no. So I'll ask a couple more questions. Please come down, and I'll just keep engaging with the group. Yeah, look, I fought during the revision commission to try to get comprehensive planning, and DCP was like all out against the idea. And for me, it's just like the name of your agency is the Department of City Planning, and I thought you'll probably get more resources for this, and I thought they were going to buy into it. But they didn't, and that bothered me. And since then, it's like more zoning than planning. And I just think that what we're asking for here is to stop talking about zoning and start talking about planning. We have issues of transportation, sustainability, jobs, schools, parks. They're all important. This one development that's housing related isn't the only thing that we need to solve for in this city. And if we do comprehensive planning, we can get there. So, and what I'm hearing here is just that if there was some initial work to do that planning, that the outcomes would be something more aligned with what people want to see, which is growth in a responsible way. Any questions? Any questions? You guys are great. All right.
You're standing in the way between lunch and them.
So look, I guess, I can stop it. Okay. So I'm just going to stop and say thank you. Oh, there's a question. There you go. And he has a dreaming sweater. Awesome.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the time. I appreciate it. My name is Donald Cogdell from Hope Astoria Church, Hope Justice. So I appreciate the some of you guys started teasing about the solutions in terms of putting the community engagement, community priority on the front end of assessment. So I was just curious about what you felt, what's within your power, and then how do we change the DCP, the process? Where does that reform start? Within your power and outside of your power, where, just kind of how do we get there?
So we can, I guess, answer. I guess the council member would be the best person to answer it, given that there's a charter mandated responsibility on land use. When I was a council member, I just told DCP, if anything gets approved without going through a community plan first, I will shut it down before it even starts. And they were like, okay. And they told every single developer, anyone that wanted to do anything, you have to go talk to the council member before we can certify something. So I kind of just laid it down, but that's not across the board. But that's how it helped for me. And we ended up doing the Bushwick Rezoning, which we spent 6 years on, working alongside DCP. And we still couldn't get it because the city didn't think it was enough. I think we were ready to produce 8,000 units of housing, and they didn't think that was enough. I think they wanted like 12 or 14. I don't know how much they wanted because they never told us. But the point being is we would go through a 6-year process to get to an end goal, get 8,000 units being produced that the community actually appreciates. And they said no. It's either all or nothing for them. So, wins and losses across the board. But I would say the only way that we could leverage it is using our mandated responsibilities through the charter to tell DCP we won't move forward with things unless you comply.
Thank you so much, Donald. I think just to add on to what the borough president has said is that what we've seen in our district, especially here when it came to Amazon, we were told by the state and the city, like, this is a done deal, like, roll over. And we said, nah, we're going to get a piñata of Jeff Bezos' head and we're going to beat it on Valentine's Day and say Queens is not for sale. Like, that's the kind of community we are. And when you can wield your own power that way through organizing, we saw it again at Annabelle Basin site for your LIC during COVID. Even with remote organizing, the city backed off and said, actually, Mayor Bill de Blasio at that time said, actually, we're going to take back the public land and y'all try to figure this out on your own, because the public outlash was so incredibly high. And that means that we got to use the media, we have to use community organizing, doing letter writing campaigns, whatever else it is to apply pressure as you build a broader coalition is really important in your power as community organizers and community folks. In our power as elected officials is organizing amongst our colleagues, organizing with overlapping elected officials from Congress, Senate, state, Assembly, Senate, as well as borough president to say, hey, we got to have our communities back. And it's not that we don't want to see anything here, but we want to see something that is right for our community when it comes to affordability or density or whatever it is that we're asking for. And the charter revisions are necessary, but it's a lot to legislate. And I want to continue to also explore when it comes to accountability on how the commission's appointments are made. Like, who becomes a commissioner? What are their ties? Maybe we should look into who they're connected to financially, or, like, how you got on that board, bro? Like, I don't see I don't see a local community member on that commission. How did you get there? Who appointed them? What is your background? Like, who do you donate to, or who donates to you, or what organizations or what boards are you on? What trustees are you part of? Like, things like that I would like to see as well.
I'll just briefly add to that for a community-based organization, especially one like SBIDC, where we're, again, fighting for a pretty niche component of the economy, it's really about fighting to force yourself into the room. So we haven't talked that much about the mayor's City of Yes plan, but, right now, DCP and the administration are going to be looking at a holistic approach to commercial zoning. And so it's important for organizations like ours to say, we really want to be part of that conversation, right? We support, this is an example, right? It's not comprehensive planning, but it's more holistic planning, and we support that. And so we have to participate in it because it's something we've been calling for a long time, but we also have to really get in the room and make sure we have the conversation about how is this going to help advance some of the equitable economic development goals that we've been talking about for so long and that elected officials have run on for so long. So I think that's important to muscle your way into the room.
Sure. Can someone lift up the ANHD bag for me? Someone's got to have an ANHD bag. What does the front say? Build
community power.
Yeah. So that's what you need to do. Like, more than anything, I think you need to build community power. Again, we're talking about like niche, like you have industrial manufacturing, you have like labor, you have, community residents, and then different folks. And we're often set up to like work against each other. And I think when we do see success around identifying either the no's that have happened or the yeses that have passed, that reflect community values, it's because there's been a broad coalition of stakeholders that have shared values, that have created a set of shared principles that guide a process and that work towards building a larger vision. I can't emphasize enough, there's just no example of a city decision, a planning decision that was a positive one for the community, where the community did not actively organize and create a shadow process to make that happen. And so I think the only thing I'd want us to invite us to do is, how do we have like shared progressive folks with values aligned? How do we actually come together and work together? How does the Bronx and Queens and Bronx and Queens and Brooklyn all come together and think about how do we actually support each other to address the citywide initiatives? It's one thing to fight, for the Kingsbridge Armory, we've been fighting for 30 years to organize. We don't have time to organize one development at a time, but we also don't have time to just organize one borough at a time, given how serious displacement and gentrification pressures are. The very few places that are left for low-income folks are kind of disappearing, right? And so it really requires us to come together and to stand in solidarity to ensure that this city works for all of us.
Organize. Any other questions? So this is the end of our panel. Thank you so much to our panelists. Please give them a round of applause. And now we'll call up the great Barika. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, everybody. I'm like, well, you guys are all quiet. I never have, y'all never don't have questions, but I imagine there's going to be a lot of conversation out. So I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank the borough president for moderating, obviously. So let's give another round of applause to this amazing panel. I want to lift up some of the things that they talked about, and to borrow what Sandra said, we want and deserve the whole pie, right? We've talked about NYCHA, jobs, labor, who is in the room, economic development, infrastructure, affordability, industrial zones, sustainability, transportation, climate. There's a whole variety of different things that just started to come up in this conversation. But what seems pretty clear from what the panelists talked about and what many of our ANHD members experiences is that our processes are broken, and they're especially broken for people of color and immigrants. What are our needs as a city, and how are we collectively participating in pursuing and meeting those needs, and how are they shared across all communities, so that the burden of meeting those needs isn't falling to certain communities and other folks aren't able to opt out in their entirety. And that a part of that is setting a path for, to borrow the borough president's phrase, planning, not just zoning, right? That we're actually planning for our future, and that a part of planning for our future is long-term engagement and bringing communities into these conversations from the beginning, right? Folks talked about 5 years, 6 years, 12 years, 30 years, right? This is long-term conversations. So I want to invite everybody into the cafe, but I hope everyone will also look out for the ways that ANHD is supporting this work, including supporting our members and council members in setting their own community vision and values as they lift up and create what land use justice looks like for themselves and their neighborhoods. Thank you, everybody, for coming today, and we'll see you outside.